So the summer's over, and all of the estuary meetings, all of the conferencing, all of the talking, all of the stage time, it's all over, and I'm trying to recalibrate and get back into my little dying local church and spending time with people who have never seen me on YouTube and will never watch YouTube and don't really care about YouTube and have no words like meaning crisis and don't know the name of Jordan Peterson and any of these things. And so I've been adjusting this week back into just being Pastor Paul again and not being a celebrity a very minor, small celebrity who has to deal with things on social media, and to sort of really cement that. Spent some time with a few people today. People had their tales of woes, and then I was in my office and Pastor Paul, because the fence is up and he can't get to the door that has a number of indelible marks over the years of him sometimes raging on it with tools. It's a pretty solid door. And but Daniel came by, and he's I think his restraining order is lifted now. It's been long enough. But I've had probably a longer, more in-depth relationship with Daniel than I've had with any of the other homeless people around the church. And it's been over a decade that we've known each other. There were a number of years when my children were younger. My wife was teaching school. I would homeschool kids during the day and then go into work afternoons and evenings. And he slept literally against the door to my office, the outside door. He slept there for years. And he's bipolar, multiple drug uses. And, I'd just often have him. He told me once that the reason he slept by the door, against the door, because I'd ask him, and there'd be garbage all over the place, and I'd have to wade through the thing just to get into my office. Why do you camp against my door? The building is long. Well, then you have to stop and talk to me. Yeah, I do. And I need to talk to him for me, not just for him, and do a lot of listening with him. He's 62 going on 63. He's lived a very interesting life. But I was so glad when he came by. Over the last 6 months, he's been living somewhere else. About a year before that, his body just simply can't take the demands of drug addiction, alcoholism, bipolar, homelessness, and he would come to me and be despondent, couldn't keep food down, et cetera, et cetera. I'd take him to the psych hospital, and he'd be in for 2 weeks, and then they'd release him again, and he'd be sort of balanced again, and within a couple of days it was off. And so I figured if I kept putting him back through that system, that at some point the system would recognize this is costing a crazy amount of money having this guy tie up hospital beds. This is all through COVID, of course, too. We need a better arrangement. And so they finally found him a placement in some sort of facility. And he finally got to the point where he would do that. For many years he wouldn't, because his excuse was always, why would I pay somebody to annoy me? Meaning he would pay out of the $1,000 disability he'd get each month, $600 to $800 of that would go to room and board. And of course they wouldn't allow drug use or alcohol use or any of that in the facility. He'd have to go out for that kind of thing. And he wouldn't have much money for it. And he wouldn't have money even for all the other things that he'd enjoy doing. One of the things that a lot of people don't recognize is a lot of these homeless people can be outrageously generous with each other and with others. I mean, he'd often have his bank account emptied because, for years he'd come to me, I need to order a new ATM card. What happened to your last one? Well, I gave it to so-and-so. And of course, his PIN number was always something like 1234. And so he'd give somebody else his card and they would drain his account and he'd be out of money a week into the month. And we would just go through those things. And of course I had the phone and he'd try to get cell phones and he could never manage a cell phone. That would always be a disaster. And I mean, we just went through, I learned so much from him over the years, like the 3 strikes with customer service representatives, 3 cuss words, they're done. And someone who's on a short fuse, especially depending on where he was in his cycle, I just go through all these things. And so he and I walked through how many things over the years. And then there was an incident, which meant that he couldn't come by anymore, and he'd spent some time in jail and some time in a locked facility, and then they let him out, and there was a restraining order, and I mean, just all of the things. And some of you know about this stuff because you've lived it. You're the child of an alcoholic, or you have a son or a daughter who's an alcoholic, or a cousin, or something like this, and so you've lived all the things. And these stories don't always have a happy ending, but they don't always have a sad ending either. And so he's been in this facility, and he gave me an address. I'll have to see if I can find it. I'll try and visit him there if I can. But I talked to another guy who I had to remove from the facility after we put up our fence, and he was panhandling at one of his regular places. And I talked to him, and oh yeah, I've seen Daniel, and he's living over by. I've got a place now too, and he's living over by me. So I don't know what kind of a place this other guy has. He's a meth addict, but he's got family too. And the other guy's a very sweet guy. He's not dangerous at all. Makes kind of a mess, but basically lived on the property for about 5 years. But for me, all of my relationships with people who don't know me on YouTube or don't know anything about me, and all this social media crazed thing, and might struggle to say who's president right now, and don't watch the news, and just basically live every day either on the street or hand to mouth or with their habit, or one way or another. It's always just spending time with these folks is recalibrating for me. One of the amazing things is that, again, one of the things pastors do a lot is listen to a lot of people's tales of woe. And that comes with the job. And often there's no fix for it. People aren't looking for a fix. They just want a listening ear to come and tell their tale of woe to, and for someone to look at them in the eye and be with them. And, years ago, I learned that most of the things that people bring to me, I cannot fix. Many of the things that are in people that need fixing, they only half want fixed, if they want it fixed at all. And people who ask for advice almost never take it or do anything with it. And so sometimes people will come up and, well, Pastor, why don't you tell them to? And it's like, and then if I've had a long enough relationship with the person, I'll just sort of turn the tables and say, well, I've told you to do things too. Well, yeah, you have. Did you do them? Well, no. So talk to me about advice giving again, will you? Most of the care of souls is listening, being with, and being with in a real yet optimistic way. One of the even with all of the talk about atheism or not believing in God or all of this, if someone can tell me that they believe that being is good, I think they're a fair way on the road to believing in a good God. I've been listening to, as you know, if you've been watching my videos, I've been listening to the Iliad and just enjoying it. But, through the literature, powerful, what a work of art it is. Cale sent me a note and said, now you're in my territory. So maybe Cale and I will have to have a talk about the Iliad. But just reading the just listening to the Iliad and understanding, the Greeks sort of in this way trying to piece together their world and trying to get a sense of the spiritual powers and the relational powers and the being around them as it is. And I've also been, I just finished up season 3 of The Boys. Got a bunch of thoughts about that as well. Again, many times people ask me if I talk about these things, Well, why are you still a Christian when you know that there's so much pain and suffering in the world? I'm still a Christian because I know there's so much pain and suffering in the world. It's amazing to me how few atheists you meet who are homeless. They all believe. They've got a bunch of interesting beliefs, but they believe in something. It's very Peterson-esque that the only the best bulwark that one of the best bulwarks that we have to deal with the onslaught of suffering in life is meaning. Well, Daniel's LDS, and so that's often a topic that we talk about because he knows he can talk about it with me, and he and I have talked about his faith for years. And he said to me today, he said something about, I've got some questions for God. And I thought, I'm sure you do, Daniel. But, and I went down to his cart and saw that he had a wallet, which was a good thing. I said, do you have you managed to keep an ID? Yeah. And he says, and I have an EBT card too. I said, good for you. You're managing well. You're doing well. You've kept I don't have to help you get a new ID. I don't have to help you get a new ATM card. I don't have to help you get a new whatever, because you're managing, you're coping, you're doing that. Good for you. But, and he says, well, I've a little short on money right now because I've been helping others. And I know that he does. And he helps in his own way. And he had some stuff that he picked out of the garbage. He had some halogen bulbs. He says, I'm not sure what these are. Can you use them? I said, no, I don't have a lamp that uses those. And then he had an old tube of silicone caulking. And this is mostly, can you use this? He used to give me food that he'd pull out of the dumpster at Smart and Final here in the neighborhood. And he'd say, well, this is still good. And that would mean that anytime I ever came home with food that wasn't, when I told my wife I'm going to the grocery store, she's like, where'd that come from? So if he gives me some food that's a little sus, I have to eat it at the office. But yeah, meaning in life, meaning of life. And then I think about all the thinky-talky stuff that we do. And if I didn't think it was important, I wouldn't do it. And after meeting many of you in Germany and the Netherlands and Ireland and England, I have a sense that the thinky-talky stuff is important. And so I'll keep doing it. I'll keep doing it partly just because it's sort of therapy for me too. Because when I listen to Daniel and others' tales of woe, it is a burden. You do have to bear it. I think part of the reason people don't like listening to each other's tales of woe is because, we have these mirror neurons, and when we sit and listen to somebody's pain, we feel their pain. A number of years ago, I was teaching a class on adult parenting. It was mostly to senior citizens, people in my church, because I noticed that in their lives, a lot of their tales of woe had to do with the tales of woe of their children. And these were individuals in their 70s and 80s, and their children were in their 30s and 40s. And so their children had all of the usual things that people deal with, drug addiction, divorce, parenting woes, money woes, all of those things. And so, of course, all of the parents of these children were carrying it. Some of them had children and grandchildren with disabilities and mental illness. And, one of the things that I told them is that so much of loving each other is suffering with and sometimes for each other. And it might be it might be the burden of listening to a tale of woe. And sometimes that's burden enough. And it's an important burden to bear, because if we're alone in our suffering, then we suffer indeed. So getting back I paused pretty much everything from this summer because I was gone. And it's the only way you could do things is sort of pause everything while I was jet setting and glad handing and talking and, doing all the things that I did. Coming back, looking at, okay, here are all the things that I was doing before, and sort of looking at them with an evaluative eye and asking, okay, maybe it's a good time to sit back and think about some big questions for me in terms of vocation. The church had one funeral while I was gone, and the saints that gather here on a Sunday morning are fewer and further between in the chairs than ever before. And we have some other good folks who come in, but it's churches are accustomed to sort of having an imagination about what everyone is doing there in the seats, and it's always never fully the way that people imagine it, but thinking about, okay, what's Livingstone's going to look like in the next 2 years, and really that's for me a topic of prayer, because my friend has questions that he'll like to ask the Lord, and I've got questions I continue to ask the Lord, and so it's okay, Lord, what are you doing with Little Livingstones, and what are you doing with my little YouTube channel, and what are you doing with Estuary, and what are you doing with Bridges of Meaning, and what are you doing with this little corner of the internet and the new friends that I've made? But again, just as with the homeless, I'm not pessimistic at all. I'm optimistic. Yet, I was on Jacob's live stream the other day, and I'll play a little bit of that because some of that rolls into some of my thinking. But Jacob is like, Jesus take the wheel is not a. I'll rephrase it for him. Jesus take the wheel is not a responsible strategy of leadership, and Jacob's right with that. The good Lord gives us meaningful responsibility, and that's a gift to us, and it's one that we should shoulder and one that we should carry. And figuring that out is always a burden of leadership, and so that's part of my wrestling. I also know that leadership is also always sort of a feeling your way forward, because the world is too big. Combinatorial explosiveness. The world is too big, and it's actually way too big. And there are great powers in the world, spiritual powers and relational powers and political powers and economic powers and military powers. There are great powers in the world, and we are small and short-lived. And so, again, being a Christian means that I will someday have to give an account for what I've done with the time that I've been given. And so I think about that. And, of course, that figures into the decisions that I make and how I spend my time and the agency that I possess and wield. So I've been posting the Thunder Bay conversations partly because I want to get them out there, and I know not all of you want to watch all of what happened in Thunder Bay, but I thought it was a tremendous conference, and I thought it was a tremendously important moment when all of the stuff that we've been using via YouTube and social media and Zoom and the way we've been connecting. Well, now we're in person, and we're doing something real, and we're making something real. And one of the important moments for me was this moment when all of us were on stage, and because it's very easy to sort of get to pay attention to the important. I don't want to diminish the importance of what we're doing in terms of our exploration of consciousness and our dialogos and all of these things, but in some ways it has to trickle down into life. And I think it's right there in the question of the framework where we can, that's exactly where the contribution of this little corner. I don't necessarily talk better on stage than I do on these videos. It's the same noodle working. Thank you, Sevilla. Where is she?
Right there.
There she is. Thank you, Sevilla, who gave us that. It's there that I think we can bring to the village a conversation of intelligibility. Because all of this question of, well, why did you talk about us leaving a spirit in Thunder Bay? I mean, when I go through the border, did you leave anything in Canada? I left a spirit. We left a spirit in Thunder Bay. Well, how did we leave it? Well, we left some in a professor, and we left some in an abbey, and we left some in the people, and I guess some are going to Winnipeg with it too. So, but it's this framework question that I think in many ways our project has been trying to integrate. Because for example, when I was listening to you two, I didn't quite want to jump out of my chair, but I felt it, that, how can we help? I think what we're doing in this little corner of the internet is trying to help people see that which is unseen, because it's always been around them, but it's been draining from the environment. And now that it's draining, and I think that's your point, Jonathan, about why can we see these things now? Well, there's this lake in California, Mono Lake, which has these tufa formations, and you can look it up on the internet. And those tufa formations were always there, but when Los Angeles and other water districts started taking water, not from the lake because it's all very salty, but from the streams leading into it, which I think is exactly the metaphor of what's been happening in the culture. The churches are no longer putting this stuff in the lake. Well, the level reduces, and suddenly there's these tufa formations, and we get these weird artifacts of, why are we going to leave a spirit in Thunder Bay? What an odd thing to say. And so I think this is the potential and the need of this little corner of the internet to continue these nerdy little conversations in a space like YouTube, where we can do it for hours, but also begin to have an eye to the village. Now, and I talked about the academy and the church and the monastery, and Jonathan Peugeot was like, why do I get the monastery? Well, and for Reiki and John and I both knew why. But the church is Mono Lake and Estuary. The church has been feeding streams of living water into Western culture for centuries now, and the churches are drying up. And at least for my part, what I see from this little corner of the internet and from what we're doing with our conversations and the quality of the conversations and what they're here for. Catherine said that quite well. Maybe I can find it here. Many hours of video in which I am talking about the sports team and the town and the body and the and the conversation that you two were just able to pick up with right away, which is what many have come to see is this. But you're also here. And I think that's vitally important, because for those who are listening, I'm pointing to Richard Mandrell. I'm personally not terribly worried about our critics.
That's good.
Maybe because I'm not in the academy.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know why you're worried.
I'm preoccupied.
But the challenge is, I pointed to Jonathan Peugeot, is here we have one of us on stage, brought into conversation, and in some ways, we believe that what we're talking about right here, is enormous. Your question to Jonathan, are these hyper agents and hyper objects, do they exist without humanity? Oh, what a question. But that is pastorally, so I'm speaking from the church chair here. Pastorally, these things that we are dealing with, I find to be so much of the vital assumed inheritance of Christendom that is beneath our institutions, and now which was the mother of modern science and modern technology. And what we are trying to do, I think, in this conference, correct me if I'm wrong, is one tiny little step towards integration. And so the intelligibility of our monkish and ecclesial, now you two share an institution, the intelligibility of what we're doing here has everything to do with, our critics. And in terms of pastoral ministry, the church can't turn away its critics. The church almost always has to bring the critics in. And I know that's not a very Protestant thing to do. Protestants are critics leaving. But I think part of what this event is about, and the reason that we are not 3 on stage but 4, is because if this little corner of the internet doesn't figure out how to continue to talk to the village, we will in some ways suffer the fate of the church that Scott talked about at the beginning of this. Because here we are. And we're going to debate about these things. And I think we are right that what we are doing is of vital interest to the village and the world. But we're going to have to bring our friend here into the conversation somehow and have this intelligible for him if this debate is going to be meaningful.
So, Paul, I'd just like to add that there are other people attending for whom this is a new vocabulary and a new conversation.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I guess that's part of the role of the church, because the posture of the church, I'm not saying that to the exclusion of the academy or the monastery, but the role of the church is always looking out to the village in a way that the academy and the monastery, they look in different ways. So I just wanted to bring that in here because, yeah, what you say it is true. I take your classes, so I wonder what's going on here. So I just want us to, I don't know, to have the 4 of us on stage. I think that's a pretty big thing for us to think about. So what are you hearing?
Well, can I ask a question first about the planning for this and how you came to choose this group of speakers?
I would love to.
I have to admit, I'm curious.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to answer that question, actually. Well, in talking with Scotland about planning this event, one of the things that was most attractive was the spirit of conversation between these 3 men, where you can see the dialogue, there's difference of opinion, difference of perspective, but they talk and they further one another's thoughts in a way that's generous but still firm in themselves and what they believe and what they see. and then pushing forward one another in that spirit of dialogue. And I very much wanted a space for that to develop and grow, and I wanted that spirit brought here so that when this is done, we've had that in Northwestern Ontario as well. And so that spirit of dialogue would remain. And so it was really important to me to have a significant portion of our time together be local, be someone here. And so you, as a very local, you live nearby, you're around in the Abbey, and your particular focus is unconsciousness. And so it felt like what a natural fit that you would be in this community, an expert in consciousness, and it would dovetail well with this conversation and give us a chance to, in this area, hopefully carry the flavor of dialogue forward. A dialogue that is honest, engaging, inquisitive, and caring. That was the thought process.
I thought that the conversation between Pajot and who was the other guy, the other professor at Thunder Bay,
Richard Mandrell.
I thought that conversation was fascinating because he is obviously a very well-informed person and knows a lot of stuff about a lot of things, but he was also like, WTF are you guys saying?
Yeah.
Right? And it was interesting hearing Pajot go through the effort at translation or catching up or whatever exactly you called it. And it reminds me of how, like, you know, so a lot of the people on the server or at meetups or what have you had maybe some amount of exposure to first wave Peterson stuff and have been paying some amount of attention to various parts of this whole shenanigans since then. But what would it take for someone who just stumbled upon this stuff now to belong, to join, to feel caught up, to feel like they're participating, etc.?
Yep.
And if it's that hard for some amount of a professor who studies consciousness or something thereabouts to get caught up, how much for the average Joe? And so that was the thought that I was having.
Now, I have to say, for those who are listening, you're not going to get this, but for those who are watching, this is on Jacob's channel, and he's using StreamYard, and he's got the Tetragrammaton just plastered along the top and the bottom. And for a community that will say Hashem because they want a circumlocution around the name, it seems a little ironic to use it as sort of a decoration. Just saying.
This is the reason I tried to have Karen on my channel. Karen Wong brings things down to a understandable common level. And I don't get to watch all of her content because we put out way too much content in this corner. Well, I can't say too much content, but we put out
You're
so
the
much
chief
content.
of sinners in that regard, Jacob. But
And you know what? This is why I've started having more just chatting streams and not having... This is one of the reasons I'm having more just chatting streams and not actually putting out as much content. Because exactly that. I think if we are going to... We need to be having more conversations. Yeah. Stephen, do I know you?
Really, for me, at the heart of my channel and my participation on it is the continued exploration of the Christian life and how it's lived in the world, at least the world around me. I don't believe Christianity will go away. Didn't mean to just put up the YouTube comments, but you can just have this up. I don't believe that Christianity will go away. I believe that Christianity will, as it has many times, continue to find vital application in churches as it does around the world today in meaningful ways for the people that pursue it. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of unrealized expectations or dreams that have failed. But it does mean for me that that God is still in heaven and doing his work and working through people and working through his church and working even outside of church by his Spirit in the world to bring this story towards whatever conclusion he has for this chapter of it. And that delightfully so, each of us gets to play along and participate one way or another. Now, obviously, some or many of you don't share that hope. And obviously, as a Christian minister, a big part of why I do what I do is to share that hope with you. But I can't. It's a gift I sort of offer, but of course, as Douglas Murray noted, he says, just telling someone to believe something doesn't mean they can. I thought that was a great moment in that conversation. And again, in terms of my theology, it's the Spirit of God that quickens, that brings to life, that gives faith, that can give us a sense of belief and assurance. And what the church gives us are often words that, if we are fortunate enough to have had a family that has blessed us with those words early on, can get deep into our hearts and our souls. What is your only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own. That finally the placement of me at the corner of Florin and Amherst is not just simply a product of me. It's a product of generations before me. It's a product of my great-great-grandfather sending my great-grandfather to North America and their participation in the Reformed Church in Spring Lake, Michigan, and the death of my great-grandmother forcing the relocation of my great-grandfather with his 6 children to the corner of Kalamazoo and Hall in southeast Grand Rapids, where my grandfather and my grandmother found each other. And my grandfather was sweet on my grandmother, but she didn't like him in that way. And my great-grandfather, who liked to paint scenery, paintings, comes into the little house that's right there on Kalamazoo Avenue that I drove past many times when I was in school, and says to my grandmother, not yet, but says to my great-grandfather, when will you give me one of those pretty paintings that you make? And he says to her, when you marry my son. And she says to him, but I've already told him I don't like him in that sort of way. Well, she would change her mind, and they would marry, and they would have a son. And that son, of course, would go to Calvin College, and he would meet Barb from Whitensville, Massachusetts, and they would have 3 children, and their middle child would be me. And they would raise me in a little church. Not too different from this one, although different in other ways. Raise me in a little struggling church to learn these words. What is your only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but belong body and soul in life and in death to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ. He has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. He also watches over me in such a way that not a hair can fall from my head without the will of my Father in heaven. Guess he willed me to be bald. In fact, all things must work together for my salvation, and that salvation word is such a big word. It isn't just, you know, hell avoidance or blessed afterlifeness. It's a working of God in a blessed way, even through the miseries and trials and troubles and things that go on in my life. Because I belong to him, Christ by his Holy Spirit assures me of eternal life. That's the life of the age to come. That's the eternal kind of life. It makes me wholeheartedly willing and ready from now on to live for him. These are pretty aspirational. It's not always wholehearted. What must you do to live and die in this comfort? 3 things. And some of you will recognize these things from my rough drafts for Sunday. First, how great my sin and misery are, and they are indeed. Second, how I am set free from all my sins and misery. Third, how I am to thank God for such deliverance. How do you come to know your misery? The law of God tells me. What does God's law require of us? Jesus teaches us this summary of the law in Matthew 22. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commands hangs all the law and the prophets. Can you live up to all of this perfectly? No. I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. And on the catechism will go from there. And so I'll continue to think about my vocation and what God is calling me to do and what God is calling me to share. And I'll continue to carry the woes and to listen to the tales of woe. And I'll continue to hopefully be able to maintain friendships with people very different from myself, who live lives that are radically different from myself. And in many respects, all of us would agree far worse. I have a home that I go to, and there's food in the refrigerator, and I have a wife who loves me, and I have children who love me. I am greatly blessed. I am greatly blessed. And even though my my church on some Sunday mornings feels like a thinly veiled insane asylum, and we look around at the meager numbers of people in the pews around us, and I know I say this often. Many people say, well, if I lived in Sacramento, I'd go to your church. Probably not. It's a few hardy folk that come, and those who stay long enough often grow to love it, and to love some of the people here, and all of its mixture of glory and sorrow and happiness and pain and joys. But I do believe, and it's that belief that gives me hope that a God as able to make a world as glorious as this one is also able to redeem it. And even though we can see just little pieces of things, we get to participate in the renovation and restoration and glorification of the first creation. And that for me is a vision and a joy that propels and moves and inspires and motivates. So every now and then I have to do one of these sort of little soul searching videos, and I often get really sweet notes from many of you, because you can tell by my tone that there's some melancholy here. There's some questioning here. There's some looking around and saying, Lord, part of it's how long, O Lord, how long? Part of it's with the psalmists who cry and lament and complain. Read the Psalms, pray the Psalms. You will find others with their tales of woe. And even as I read the Iliad and consider the Greeks and their struggles and their cares and their worryings and their wanderings. So yes, there is a degree of melancholy, and there is a questioning, and there is a seeking after God's own heart. But there is also, doing so, a confidence that my God is good, and He is able. And if you had asked me 5 years ago whether I would have had the opportunities to meet many of you in the Netherlands and Germany and Ireland and the UK and Southern California and Chicago, all the different places that we've met, I would have the opportunity to meet many of you, and Christian and non-Christian alike, of course, obviously, and to see some of God's glory in you, in your brilliance and your goodness and your kindness and your generosity. So many of you have been very generous with me, and it's a true honor and a privilege. But yet, there is in the faith always a seeking, because you can't hold a vision of that which is good and powerful with the promise that it's coming and not see the way we are right now. I gave Daniel a bag of recyclables that I just emptied my garbage can of my recycling garbage can. So there's all these recyclables, and he dutifully crushing all the air out of them. The belief that the best is yet to come. The belief that even what we look upon as that which can't be redeemed, that there is hope of redemption. The belief that in all of the indignities of old age, of declining health, of dying. Maybe I should read Mabel's story one more time. It's a great story. This is from John Ortberg's book, The Life You've Always Wanted. It's an amazing story he got from a pastor named Tom Smith. The state-run convalescent hospital is not a pleasant place. It is large, understaffed, and overfilled with senile and helpless and lonely people who are waiting to die. On the brightest of days, it seems dark inside, and it smells of sickness and stale urine. I went there once or twice a week for 4 years, but I never wanted to go there. I always left with a sense of relief. It is not the kind of place one gets used to. On this particular day, I was walking in a hallway that I had not visited before, looking in vain for a few who were alive enough to receive a flower and a few words of encouragement. This hallway seemed to contain some of the worst cases, strapped into carts and into wheelchairs, looking completely helpless. As I neared the edge of this hallway, I saw an old woman strapped up in a wheelchair. Her face was an absolute horror. The empty stare and white pupils of her eyes told me that she was blind. The large hearing aid over one ear told me that she was also half deaf. She was almost deaf. One side of her face was being eaten by cancer. There was a discolored and running sore covering part of one cheek, and it had pushed her nose to one side, dropped one eye, and distorted her jaw so that what should have been the corner of her mouth was just the bottom of her mouth. As a consequence, she drooled constantly. I was told later that when new nurses arrived, the supervisors would send them to feed this woman, thinking that if they could stand this sight, they could stand anything in the building. I also learned later that this woman was 89 years old and that she had been here, bedridden, blind, nearly deaf, and alone for 25 years. This was Mabel. I've been at Living Stones 25 years. She was there 25 years. I don't know why I spoke to her. She looked less likely to respond than most of the people I saw in that hallway, but I put a flower in her hand and said, "Here is a flower for you. Happy Mother's Day." She held the flower up to her face and tried to smell it, and then she spoke. And much to my surprise, her words, although somewhat garbled because of her deformity, were obviously produced by a clear mind. She said, "Thank you. It's lovely. But can I give it to someone else? I can't see it, you know. I'm blind." I said, "Of course." And I pushed her in her chair back down the hallway to a place where I thought I could find some alert patients. I found one and I stopped the chair. Mabel held out the flower and said, "Here, this is from Jesus." That was when it began to dawn on me that this was not an ordinary human being. Later, I wheeled her back to her room and learned more about her history. She had grown up in a small farm that she managed until only her mother until her mother died. Then she ran the farm alone until 1950, when her blindness and sickness sent her to the convalescent hospital. For 25 years she got weaker and sicker, with constant headaches, backaches, and stomach aches, and then the cancer came too. Her 3 roommates were all human vegetables who screamed occasionally but never talked. They often soiled their bedclothes, and because the hospital was understaffed, especially on Sundays when I usually visited, the stench was often overpowering. Mabel and I became friends over the next few weeks, and I went to see her once or twice a week for the next 3 years. Her first words to me were usually an offer of hard candy from a tissue box near her bed. Some days I would read to her from the Bible, and often I would pause. She would continue reciting the passage from memory, word for word. On other days I would take a book of hymns and sing with her, and she would know all the words of the old songs. For Mabel, these were not merely exercises in memory. She would often stop mid-hymn and make a brief comment about lyrics. She considered particularly relevant to her own situation. I never heard her speak of loneliness or pain except in the stress she placed on certain lines in certain hymns. She sang her tales of woe in the words of the Bible and in the words of the hymns. It was not many weeks before that I turned from a sense that I was being helpful to a sense of wonder, that I would go to her with a pen and paper to write down the things she would say. During one hectic week of final exams, I was frustrated because my mind seemed to be pulled in 10 different directions at once with all kinds of things that I had to think about. The question occurred to me, what does Mabel have to think about? Hour after hour, day after day, week after week, not even able to know if it's day or night. So I went to her and asked, "Mabel, what do you think about when you lie here?" She said, "I think about my Jesus." I sat there and thought for a moment about the difficulty for me of thinking about Jesus for even 5 minutes, and I asked, "What do you think about Jesus?" She replied slowly and deliberately as I wrote, "I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me in my life, you know. I'm one of those kinds who's most satisfied. Lots of people wouldn't care much for what I think. Lots of folks would think I'm kind of old-fashioned, but I don't care. I'd rather have Jesus. He's all the world to me." Then Mabel began to sing the old hymn. "Jesus is all the world to me, my life, my joy, my all. He's my strength from day to day. Without him I would fall." Doesn't matter if it's a campy hymn with all those rhymey songs. When I am sad, to him I go. No other one can cheer me so. When I am sad, he makes me glad. He's my friend. This is not fiction. Incredible as it may sound, a human being really lived like this. I knew her. How could she do it? Seconds ticked and minutes crawled, and so did days and weeks and months and years of pain, without human company and without an explanation of why it was all happening, and she lay there and sang hymns. How could she do it? The answer, I think, is that Mabel had something that you and I don't have much of. She had power. Lying there in that bed, unable to move, unable to see, unable to hear, unable to talk to anyone, she had incredible power. Here's an ordinary human being who received supernatural power to do extraordinary things. You say, well, what? Surely if she had supernatural power. She could cure the cancer that's eating her face. She could whisk herself out of a crappy nursing home. She could at least do something for herself. She could couldn't she turn stone into bread? Here was an entire life consisted of following Jesus as best she could in her situation. Patient endurance of suffering, solitude, prayer, meditation on scripture, worship, fellowship when it was possible, giving when she had a flower or a piece of candy to offer. Imagine her in her condition saying, I think about how good he's been to me. He's been awfully good to me, you know. I'm one of those kind who's most satisfied. This is the 23rd Psalm come to life. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. For anyone who really saw Mabel, who was willing to turn aside, a hospital bed became a burning bush, a place where this ordinary and pain-filled world was visited by the presence of God. When others saw the life in that hospital bed, they wanted to take off their shoes. The lid was off the terrarium. Then the turn came, with a catch of the breath and a beating of the heart and tears. They were standing on holy ground. Do you believe such a life is possible for an ordinary human being? And now there's a burden to carrying a story like this, because it's, well, what about Daniel? Or what about Billy? Or what about so-and-so? What about Elmer? There's a burden. I was asked when I was in London, I had a question and answer in the church, and might be able to get the video from it, because they did take video. It was just on a cell phone. I don't know if it's any good. I don't know if it worked out well, but a young woman asked me if I believed in miracles. And I said, yes, I do. And, well, how can you believe in those? And I said, it's really not, for me, the question of how I can believe in miracles. I've just seen too much. And it's not hard for me to believe in miracles. And you may or may not, and that's okay. But I don't have a hard time believing in miracles. I said, it's harder when the miracle doesn't come. It's harder when you see someone who seemingly undeservingly receives or even wields a miracle, and then you see someone more deservingly not receive one. That's the burden to bear. But it's amazing that the temptations of Christ, those stories revolve around the withholding of miracles. And when Jesus is being crucified, of course the mockers say he saved others, he cannot save himself. And of course Christians' theology says, no, he wasn't saving himself in order to save others. And so as I told to my seniors when I was running that ministering to adult children, I thought of that course when a therapist once said, the bookstores are filled with books about how to raise children and how to parent young children and teenage children. There's like no books for how to be a parent to adult children. I thought, yeah, she's right. And then as I was coming up with a curriculum for that class, not that I'm an expert in any way, and I said, the key to almost all ministry is your capacity to bear suffering. At least according to Mabel, that's actually a key to glory. And of course, in Christianity, that should be no surprise, because the climax of the book of glory in the Gospel of John is the crucifixion, which the Gospel of John calls his glorification, which, if you understand that word, let's say in contrast to the Iliad, is deeply, deeply stark. Why do I make these videos? Sometimes I have to preach to myself. Sometimes I have to talk myself back into believing. It's a good thing I've had all these years of preaching experience. But some of the most important preaching experience has been preaching to myself. Because it's a prayer, it's a psalmist prayer of how long, O Lord, how long? Jesus, of course, quite famously on the cross, begins with the recitation of Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jordan Peterson says, archetypal stories are such because you can't get outside of them. They go all the way to the limits. And I think that's what you find in the cross of Christ. And also the resurrection. Because the glorification on the cross is not the same without the resurrection. In some ways, it's just a really strange outcome from a very common Roman crucifixion. So if you watch this video and you worry for me, you can certainly pray for me. I'll always take your prayers. And then what you can pray for is that God continue to make a way and lead a way for this little corner of the internet to figure out, okay, what part can we play in this grand story of human history? It's a little corner of the internet, and I'm sure it'll be just a little part, just like I pastor a little church, and that is absolutely okay. In some of the same way that incredible power that Mabel had lit up just a little corner of a really crappy nursing home. But I'll tell you, so often, that's where you find him. Don't look for him on CNN. Don't look for him on the steps of some pillared building in Washington, D.C. Don't look for him with the bright lights on and the television cameras streaming. Go into some little place. The place that you would least likely to expect to find him. And there you very well may see his glory. His glory in people that look like this. That'll do for now. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.